Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion of Shared Legacies, the African American Jewish Civil Rights Alliance. We are so pleased to have so many houses of worship of varying faiths and denominations and faith-based and social action organizations joining us tonight. Tonight's program is a collaborative effort of Westchester Jewish Council's Combating Racism Committee, working in close partnership with our member organizations, our friends at Congregation Bet Torah's Racial Justice Committee in Mount Kisco, New York, and the American Jewish Committee of Westchester and Fairfield counties. I am Lawrence Engel, Chair of Westchester Jewish Council's Combating Racism Committee, and thank each of these organizations and their leadership, WJC's President Lisa Roberts and AJC's President Stephanie Berrin, for their guidance and partnership on this and many other projects. I personally thank my council vice chair, Lisa Ginsburg, and Elizabeth Schoenfeld, an AJC leader, and Linda Dishner, all of whom are also members of Bet Torah's Racial Justice Committee. At approximately 8:45, there will be a question and answer session. Please submit questions into the chat box. All of your microphones will be muted. Bet Torah's Racial Justice Committee grew out of a desire to educate our community on understanding and acknowledging the complex issues of systemic racial injustice that continue to face our nation today. It is a goal of the committee, with programs such as tonight, to continue the dialogue and to find meaningful ways to engage in anti-racist activities to fight that injustice. Since 1975, the mission of Westchester Jewish Council has been to connect, convene, and safeguard Westchester's Jewish communities and strengthen relationships among Jews and our member organizations, Westchester area Jewish community to Israel, the Jewish community to our elected officials, and Jews to other ethnic and faith-based individuals and organizations. The mission of WJC's Combating Racism Committee is to enable the Westchester Jewish community to have a meaningful impact on combating racism, bigotry, and prejudice around us. It is our goal to nurture positive changes in culture and approach, enabling us to create meaningful and positive relationships between the Westchester Jewish community and communities of color, so that together we can build a more inclusive and welcoming home for all. AJC, the American Jewish Committee, is the oldest Jewish civil rights organization in the United States. With a 114-year history as a leading voice and force in the struggle against racism and anti-Semitism, AJC, the leading global Jewish advocacy organization, has developed unparalleled access to government officials, diplomats, and other world leaders. AJC is a historic leader in Black-Jewish relations, from research that became a major part of the landmark Brown versus Board of Education case, to the 2019 launch of the Congregational Black Jewish Caucus at AJC's Global Forum in Washington, D.C. Through its partnership's tireless work, AJC is able to impact opinion and policy on the issues that matter most: combating rising anti-Semitism and extremism, defending Israel's place in the world, and safeguarding the rights and freedoms of all people. Before I continue, please join me in listening to a welcoming message from Congressman Jamal Bowman and a message from Congressman Mondaire Jones.
Good evening, American Jewish Committee of Westchester. Happy MLK Day 2021 to you and your family. I hope that everyone is staying as safe as they possibly can be and doing as much as possible to come together in love and empathy and compassion and solidarity to make sure our families and communities are safe. I look forward to continuing to work with you. It's very important for the African American and Jewish community to work together to uplift all of our communities, especially not only as we deal with a raging pandemic, which is COVID, but as we also deal with the rise of white nationalism and white supremacy, and the idea that because you are Jewish or because you are African American, you don't belong here. So I look forward to working with you all. Hope you and your families are as safe as you possibly can be. And it's an amazing time to celebrate Dr. King and remember so many of his messages, not only the radical redistribution of political and economic power, but the understanding and the belief that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final say in reality. Thank you so much. Looking forward to working with you. Peace and love. Be well.
I'm so grateful to be with you all today. As a Black American, I feel a close kinship with my Jewish sisters and brothers, who I know are my allies in the unfinished fight for social justice. Today, I am reminded of Dr. King's expression of solidarity to the American Jewish Congress in 1958. He said, "My people were brought to America in chains. Your people were driven here to escape the chains fashioned for them in Europe. Our unity is born of our common struggle for centuries, not only to rid ourselves of bondage, but to make oppression of any people by others an impossibility." King's words were prescient. Thousands of young Jewish people joined the struggle for racial justice in the 1960s, some even sacrificing their lives. In 1964, two young Jewish New Yorkers named Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner traveled to Mississippi to join the Freedom Summer, a campaign to register Black people in Mississippi to vote in spite of prohibitive Jim Crow laws. Their work caught the attention of the Ku Klux Klan. That June, Schwerner, Goodman, and Black activist James Chaney were murdered in one of the most infamous acts of domestic terrorism in American history. The KKK abducted the three men, beat them, shot them, and buried at least one of them alive. Their bodies were recovered 2 months later. Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner stand apart for their sacrifice, but not for their fight. They came from a long line of Jewish Americans standing alongside Black Americans in the ongoing, unfinished struggle for racial justice in this country. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was co-founded by Henry Moskowitz, a Jewish man. Kivy Kaplan, another Jewish man, later served as the president of the NAACP for 9 years. Jack Greenberg was Thurgood Marshall's right-hand man, helping him litigate Brown v. Board of Education and eventually succeeding him as director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Several rabbis joined demonstrations in Birmingham and Selma, where Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel marched arm in arm with King. Like those before them, Goodman and Schwerner recognized that Black and Jewish people have much in common. After hundreds of years of violent, oftentimes legalized oppression, our very existence is an act of defiance. We deserve to live in a society where everyone, regardless of religion, ethnicity, or race, is treated with dignity and respect. Where, in the words of Dr. King, we are all judged by the content of our character. To some, this may all seem like ancient history. But the fact is, white nationalism is on the rise in the United States, and the Black and Jewish communities have been feeling its wrath. In Charlottesville, white nationalist rioters chanted, quote, "Jews will not replace us," unquote, as they assaulted Black counter-protesters. In Minnesota and Louisiana, arsonists burned a synagogue and a Black church to the ground. In Pittsburgh and Charleston, gunmen shot down innocent worshipers in a synagogue and a Black church. At the violent insurrection at the United States Capitol on January 6th, where members of Congress like myself nearly died at the hands of domestic terrorists carrying Confederate flags alongside others wearing Holocaust regalia. With this country's future at stake in the 117th Congress, it is more important than ever that we heed the lessons of the civil rights movement. We must stand together in solidarity with all oppressed people. We must band together against bigotry, whether religious, ethnic, racial, or otherwise. And most of all, we must not let acts of hate divide us. Because when we fight together, we win. Thank you.
Thank you, Representatives Bowman and Jones. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge our honorable elected representatives or their surrogates who are in attendance this evening. Representative from U.S. Senator Chuck Schumer's office, Congressman Jamal Bowman, Congressman Mondaire Jones, New York State Senator Shelley Mayer, New York State Assemblyman Steve Otis, Judge Veronica Hummel, New York State Court of Claims, Westchester County Executive George Latimer, Westchester County District Attorney Miriam Roca, Westchester County Legislator Nancy Barr, Westchester County Legislator Nicole Benjamin, Westchester County Human Rights Commission Executive Director Tejas Sanchella, and finally, Marvin Krislov, President, Pace University. Thank you all. Tonight's program will be moderated by Reverend Doris Dalton, Chair of Westchester County Human Rights Commission. Reverend Dalton is a preacher, a teacher, and a community organizer. Reverend Dalton is a convener of the Westchester Coalition for Police Reform and is the chair for the Order of Deacons in the New York Conference of the United Methodist Church. She is an alumna of the Christian Leadership Initiative, a partnership program of the American Jewish Committee and the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. She has 20 years of experience in nonprofit and faith-based organizations serving God's people, particularly those who are the least, the last, and the lost. We thank and welcome our esteemed panelists. Dr. Shari L. Rogers, PhD, is a producer, director, and head director of Shared Legacies. Dr. Rogers is a clinical therapist and social activist whose work encompasses movie production, writing, educational programming, and curriculum development. Dr. Rogers is the president and founder of Spill the Honey, a Michigan-based 501c3 organization committed to promoting human dignity as well as advancing public knowledge of the Holocaust and the civil rights movement. Spill the Honey advances cultural tolerance, draws attention to contemporary injustices, and encourages young people to become compassionate global citizens. Shared Legacies is her first film. TIffany Hamilton is Managing Director of Transformational Solutions Workgroup and the inaugural Chief Diversity Officer of Pace University. Most recently, Ms. Hamilton was the Chief Diversity Officer of Westchester Community College. While there, Ms. Hamilton developed and executed on a plan that leveraged data analysis to discern and address equity gaps in student achievement, refined the hiring process, and implemented cultural competence programming to increase awareness of unconscious bias and provide strategies for more effective communication and engagement. Dr. Susannah Heschel is an American scholar and the Eli Black Professor of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College. Her scholarship focuses on Jewish-Christian relations in Germany during the 19th and 20th centuries, the history of biblical scholarship, and the history of anti-Semitism. Her numerous publications include Abraham Geiger and the Jewish Jesus, and the Aryan Jesus, Christian Theologians, and the Bible in Nazi Germany. It is my understanding that her current work in progress is The Jewish Fascination with Islam, the history of Jewish scholarship on Islam, and its impact on modern Jewish self-understanding. Dr. Heschel is a Guggenheim Fellow and the recipient of numerous awards, including 4 honorary doctorates. She is the daughter of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who is featured in the film. In his Nobel lecture in Oslo on December 11, 1964, entitled The Quest for Peace and Justice, Nobel laureate Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "We still have a long, long way to go before the dream of freedom is a reality for the Negro in the United States. We must still face prodigious hilltops of opposition and gigantic mountains of resistance. But with patient and firm determination, we'll press on until every valley of despair is exalted to new peaks of hope, until every mountain of pride and irrationality is made low by the leveling process of humility and compassion, until the rough places of injustice are transformed into a smooth plane of equality of opportunity, and until the crooked places of prejudice are transformed by the strengthening process of bright-eyed wisdom. Immediately preceding Dr. King on the rostrum on August 28, 1963, was Dr. King's friend and co-collaborator of the March on Washington, Rabbi Joachim Prinz. What follows are excerpts from Rabbi Prinz's speech. As Jews, we bring to this great demonstration, in which thousands of us proudly participate, a twofold experience, one of the spirit and one of our history. In the realm of the spirit, our fathers taught us thousands of years ago that when God created man, he created him as everybody's neighbor. Neighbor is not a geographic term. It is a moral concept. It means our collective responsibility for the preservation of man's dignity and integrity. Our children, yours and mine, in every school across the land, each morning pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States and to the republic for which it stands. They, the children, speak fervently and innocently of this land as a land of liberty and justice for all. The time, I believe, continued Rabbi Prinz, has come to work together, for it is not enough to hope together, and it is not enough to pray together. To work together that this children's oath, pronounced every morning from Maine to California, from north to south, may become a glorious, unshakable reality in a morally renewed and united America. Let us begin. Reverend Dalton, the program is yours.
Thank you so much, Larry, for having me, and thank you to the AJC and the WJC and the Racial Justice Committee. It is my honor to be with all of you. I see many of my friends and colleagues in the participant list. Hello, everyone. Happy New Year. And I'm very pleased to be with Dr. Rogers, Dr. Heschel, and also the excellent and wonderful TIffany Hamilton. So let's begin. Let's talk about this documentary. So the first question I have is for Shari, Dr. Rogers. First of all, congratulations on this excellent documentary. It is fabulous. And I am so impressed that this is your first film. I believe I speak for all of us when I say, please keep making films. Please keep making films. So I have this question. Since the film premiered, how has it been received and where have you seen its greatest impact?
Well, thank you. And what an honor to be with this esteemed group. And what I find is I learned so much from all these panels, and just listening to everybody and listening to your representatives, I'm just, in the temple, I'm just so honored. We opened right before COVID in Atlanta. It was the 20th anniversary of the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival. And I felt so honored because Sherry Frank, who is Congressman John Lewis's, I would say, closest Jewish soul sister, obviously, they rekindled this amazing Black Jewish coalition in the early 80s. And she really rolled up her sleeves, I have to say, and welcomed me into Atlanta. So much so that for our big fundraiser at the temple, Congressman John Lewis and Reverend C.T. Vivian attended. Can you imagine? And we showed like 15-minute pieces and they spoke afterwards. So you can really see just from the welcoming of this whole experience, why they were able to get so much done. Like as soon as we told them about it, they just, made calls, pulled people together, and the coalition just flowed. So we opened to 2,400 people and we received the jury prize for building bridges. And since COVID hit, basically, we've been showing the film virtually, and communities are coming together to watch the film, basically to use the film for courageous conversations, just like we're doing tonight. So I'm really excited, and I'm hoping that this has some healing opportunities as well. Wonderful.
I hope so too, and I believe that our discussion tonight will begin to rejuvenate some of that healing here with all of us. The next question is for Dr. Heschel or Professor Heschel. This documentary was so fun to watch. Loved hearing the stories about your father, Rabbi Heschel, and about his close relationship with the Reverend Dr. King. I love imagining you as a little girl, hanging out with Dr. King and all of his lieutenants. It's so neat. So how did your father's civil rights work influence you?
So thank you. And I want to say how wonderful it is to be here. I love the film. I'm grateful that Shari Rogers spent so many years of her life dedicated to making this film, because I think we also have to realize that she was able to interview people, some of whom are no longer with us. And that's really extraordinary, a real gift to us. Shari Rogers, really thank you very much. And it's so important for people to see this film and to learn from it, learn something about our history. Yes, I was, of course, influenced. And I would say, I also just, I find it extraordinary to have heard these two representatives who spoke to us, Jamal Bowman and Mondaire Jones. They are marvelous. I want to move to New York so I can vote for them. Yeah. But I just will say that what I learned growing up were several things. Number one, I learned that religion, a religious person, cannot be racist, that religion and race are absolutely incompatible. My father said that racism is Satanism, unmitigated evil. You cannot be a religious person and believe that God is the creator of all human beings and then treat some human beings with contempt. It's impossible. Now, my father also said, we, all of us human beings, we forfeit the right to worship God as long as we maintain a racist society. How can you be a religious person? How can we have a house of worship with racism in our hearts and in our society? We talk about it as systemic racism. And I think that has a somewhat abstract quality to it. And we need sometimes to be very concrete. And that's actually what we're talking about here in this country right now at this moment, a very concrete issue. We have watched George Floyd be murdered. That is a horror that should weigh heavily on each American citizen, because this was a murder conducted by representatives of the state, the police wearing a badge issued by the state. And this has happened over and over again. So yes, we have still a great deal of work to do. And I have to say that on January 6th, I suddenly became very frightened that because we have left the racism of this country pretty much unattended and not worked on for such a long time, that this is going to destroy us. That has the possibility, the danger that faces us is that by not dealing with the racism of this country, with the legacy of slavery, the legacy of Jim Crow, the legacy of the murder of Native Americans, that this left untouched, unresolved, that this could bring us down. We could destroy ourselves, and that is a horror. So tonight we're gathered to talk about this and talk about what to do together.
I have a follow-up question for you, Professor Heschel. So I've had the honor of participating in a few Passover Seders over the years. And one of the Passover Seders I'm a Christian pastor, by the way, in case anyone is not sure. One of the Passover Seders I attended, the host put an orange on the Passover Seder plate and explained that this orange is a recent addition, and the orange represents the inclusion of women and LGBTQIA communities and others. I have since heard that it was you who started this custom. Is this true?
Yes, it's true.
Yes, it's true. Okay, so yay, amazing. I love the boldness and the sense of solidarity in creating a space for the disenfranchised to be seen and heard, even on something as common yet so profoundly meaningful as the Passover Seder plate. So I love that. So my question for you is, I mean, this is a small act of inclusion that you decided to do, that you just decided, I'm going to take it upon myself to create space on the Seder plate for women and for others who are not normally seen and heard at this time. And I'm trying to pull from what you just said about what your father taught you about inclusion and how racism is Satanism, right? It is against the very fiber and core of what it means to be a religious person. So going to the what do we do, I'm just going to kickstart that what do we do conversation. This act of inclusion was so simple, right? And so meaningful. What is it about this act of inclusion that helped you to see, oh, this is something I can do, and you connected it to your father's influence on you? Do you see where I'm going with this question? It's kind of a long-winded question, but I'm just trying to pull these pieces together.
Yes, and actually there is a link to today. Let me say this. So I was a student, and it was in the 1980s, and I was inspired to this custom by some undergraduates at Oberlin College. I wasn't studying there, but I visited. But I also want us to just remember for a moment what was happening in this country in the early 1980s. There was a terrible plague that was killing gay men. No one knew what was going on. It was some new horrible disease and a horrible, horrible death. And we lost so many wonderful young men, older men, gay men. And what did we have? We had a president who was saying who wouldn't give any money for the research. There were ministers saying this is a punishment from God for being gay. Horrible things. That's when I started this custom of the orange out of solidarity with gay and lesbian Jews. And now today, what do we have? What are we facing in this country? We're facing racism in this country that's also a disease that is destroying us, that's killing us. And I mean killing Black men, women, and children, but also killing the conscience of every white person who observes, who sees. What are we going to do to save ourselves right now? So yes, my father spoke of inclusion, and for me, it was absolutely, growing up, it was impossible not to speak up. I learned from my father, from Dr. King and the civil rights leaders about courage. Courage.
Thank you. So powerful. So powerful. I'm still thinking about what you said. Now I want to turn to TIffany. TIffany and I had a chance to connect a little bit before this event, and I'm so thankful, TIffany, that you are here with us. I want to acknowledge that you are offering to share your unique perspectives and your life experiences as a woman who was Black in America with all 244 of us. So thank you for the gift that you are offering to all of us tonight. I wanted to name that first. So when you and I were talking earlier, you shared an aha moment that you had while you were watching this documentary and how it connected to your own family experiences and your memories. Could you share that with us now?
I sure can. I'd like to take a point of privilege first to just thank the organizers for creating this space, creating room for the conversation. And if I could piggyback off of what Dr. Rogers, Professor Heschel, and what you have said, Reverend Dalton, much of what we're talking about and what we saw in the documentary were bold and audacious folks that were willing to make room, right? That did not let their own personal affiliations prevent them from getting in proximity, right? And there was a representative that talked about that closer to the end of the documentary. And so I just thank the organizers for allowing us to get approximate with one another, even in this virtual space. And I think now more than ever is the time to take advantage of these virtual spaces to get approximate with one another, because it's making room for the conversation and conversing not just with who you know, but the brother, the sister of the other that you may not be familiar with. And so I'm appreciative of this time. And so the other thing that I wanted to share, just echoing off of what's already been stated, is, when we talk about what can we do, what I saw also in that documentary was that there was no conflict of who I was religiously or professionally, or who I was religiously or personally. They were one and the same. And I think that's an opportunity we all can take, just given the nature of the work that I do. I connect with folks where I can observe and discern when someone is conflicted morally, but they produce something different professionally. And so when we think about what is it that we can do, we can bridge that disconnect between that personal and religious self so that we can boldly show up in our spaces. And what I saw in the documentary, that was the aha moment for me, that really sent me to the phone to call my grandmother, was the piece of the documentary when it talked about Sears Roebuck and its placement in the Black community. Now, listen, I will share, I am originally from the Midwest. I'm from Kansas City, Missouri. My father is from North Little Rock, Arkansas. And growing up, I was very familiar with segregation and the stories, right? But what I also was familiar with was the Sears Roebuck catalog that would come regularly, that if we needed tires from the car, it came from Sears. And I was wondering, what was this connection or this loyalty, if you will, to Sears? And so to see that manifest itself in the documentary, that connection was not just because they had the best deal in town, but perhaps it's because they had a fundamental commitment for the Black American experience, for one to be able to engage fully with lines of credit, decent clothing. And we saw that with Zimmerman's in the documentary. And so that was an aha for me that, you know, I'm a borderline millennial, that connected me more deeply to the movement than before seeing the documentary. So I really appreciated bringing that out. And it also spoke to the position of business and industry and its role in advancing the social justice agenda, right? So there you have it.
All things are connected. They are all connected. I love hearing that story. So thank you for that. And also thank you for the wonderful intro that you gave about how this is all connected. Shari, I wanted to just comment on the fact that you are, not only are you a filmmaker, now you can add filmmaker to your list, but that you are a clinical therapist and a social worker. And I see how you have brought these professional areas into your nonprofit work and also into your filmmaking. So for me, one of the primary messages of this documentary was the power of knowing each other's stories and narratives. So as you were putting this documentary of the coalition between Black Americans and American Jews together, what has been the healing power of storytelling and narrative for you?
Thank you so much. I think it's just learning so much. And when it's sort of like as a therapist, when you sit with a patient, you have to listen. That's first of all, you have to listen. And the way that you can really help a patient is finding that experience within inside yourself, where you've been devalued yourself, or when you felt really lonely yourself. And if you can put words, if you will, to someone's experience, but you first have to be courageous enough to be able to look within yourself first. And I think that was the beauty of Dr. Heschel, Rabbi Joshua Heschel and Dr. Martin Luther King, is that they were able to listen to each other and have this deep compassion for each other. And I think what I've learned from the movie also is I didn't really know how much Dr. King really used the Exodus story as the foundation to build the protest in America during the 60s. If you think of the Exodus story, the foundation of that narrative, it's the first protest, basically, when Moses said, you can't treat other people like this. I mean, you can't make another human being a slave. It's not right. It's just not right. And you can't dehumanize human beings like that. And so I think the world sort of knows this Exodus story, and the fact that Dr. King used it to motivate. So there's so much that I learned and I continue to learn. And I do this often because it's very helpful for me, and this might help the group. I'm going to ask Dr. Heschel to relay what the Rebbe's taught her father about this healing and about pain.
Yeah, please. You're on.
I appreciate very much that Shari has asked me to talk about this. My father came from Poland, from Warsaw, from a Hasidic family, a very, very religious family. And then he went to Berlin in 1927 to study at the university. And he was there when Hitler came to power. And he got out at the last minute. He came to this country in March of 1940. He was rescued by the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. But the Hasidic world that he knew was destroyed, wiped out by the Nazis. But the piety that he tried to convey from that world, I think has something to tell us today. And that's what Shari has asked me to mention. My father was named for one of his ancestors who had the name Avram Yeshua Heschel. He came from Ukraine, from Opt. He was known as the Opter-Rav. And he wrote a book. He was known by the nickname, the Ohev Yisrael, the one who loves God, really is what it means in Hasidism. But he was very charismatic and very warm, and people would come to him every day, dozens of people. People would go to the Rebbe and they would tell him all of their problems and ask him to pray for them, for a sick child, for someone who lost a job, what to do. And he would listen. He would listen very intently. But one day his assistant asked him, how do you remember all of these people's and all of these problems that everybody has? And you tell them you're going to pray for them, but how do you remember? And he said, you know, when somebody comes to me and they pour out their troubles, I open my heart and their problems come in my heart and they make a scar. And when I go to pray, I open my heart and I say, look, God, at all these scars. And I think, you know, that's in a sense what it is to be a Hasidic Rebbe, a rabbi, but a Rebbe who spends his whole life trying to cultivate his inner life to be the kind of person who listens in that way, who prays in that way. And I think what we all want more than anything also is to be listened to in that way. And if we can, to become the kind of person who can listen to others with that kind of a heart. So that, I think, is, in a sense, a kind of building block of the kind of beloved community that Dr. King talked about. How do we become that kind of a person? And I would just say that the civil rights leaders whom I met have been extraordinary human beings. And when they studied nonviolence, it wasn't simply about if someone hits you, you don't hit back. It was a training that took many months to change the way they think, to change their minds, their hearts, their souls, to become a different kind of person, a person who is gentle, who listens, who understands the other side and never disparages, and the kind of person of gratitude. And I also have to say, every time I meet someone from the civil rights era who knew my father, they hug me, they love me, they tell me how grateful they are. Now that was, 60 years ago, and they're still expressing gratitude. What does it take to cultivate gratitude in ourselves? So I wish, in a way, all of us, everyone in the United States, could undergo that kind of nonviolent training and transform ourselves and our hearts.
To have hearts scarred for each other.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. That's so beautiful. So, moving along the same stream of thought, I wanted to go to TIffany. TIffany, the American Jews and the Black Americans in the 50s and 60s, they recognized that they had a common story. And I love, Shari, how you pulled those pieces together where they're recognizing those little bits of narratives where they were saying, oh, I see that. I see this is my story. That's my story. So they heard this common narrative in each other's houses of worship and in the sermons and the meditations on the Exodus story. And they said, oh, this is my story. So fast forward to today, TIffany. So the stories and the narratives of our communities are more complex than they were back in the 50s and 60s, right? There are multiple narratives and they don't always look and sound the same as each other's narratives. So as we're looking at this complexity of narratives and how they've transformed over time, what are some of the commonalities and the differences that you notice in these narratives today?
So thank you for the question. There are a couple things here that I want to hit on in response to that, and it ties into what Professor Heschel was just speaking on. All right, so we started with the importance of making room. What are we making room for? I'm glad you asked. We're making room for the stories and the scars, right? We're making room for the stories and the scars while not participating in an oppression Olympics, because we can get caught up in, well, I went through this, you went through that. Here's where we have to stay. We have to stay in the space that harm has been caused to humanity, period. And in recognition of that harm, I'm going to make room for you and your story. I'm going to hear the hurt, and we're going to sit collectively together to talk about the healing. But before we get to that finish line, if you will, of healing, we've got to understand that in that narrative, we talked about, excuse me, in the documentary, we saw the variations of prayer and prayer taking place in a variety of different spaces. But one of the questions we have to walk away with is what are we praying for? Because if one faith is praying for peace and the other faith is praying for justice, therein lies the disconnect. So if I'm asking my God to open my heart and see the scars, am I showing the scars of the brother, or am I showing the scars of the desired healing and the desired peace, and not necessarily the justice? And so, but I think that's one of the takeaways that introspectively we all have to think about. Yes, let's make room for the stories and the scars, but in my prayers, am I praying for peace and justice, or just the peace because that's what I know? And if the answer to that question is that I've been sitting praying for peace, then that's where we start. I need to make room to understand the cries for justice, right? And so I think that's where we see a bit of the difference. In the documentary, we saw very clearly there was synergy in the agenda. And I think today there may be a bit of a disconnect, but where there isn't, where we have bridged that disconnect, that's what we need to amplify. That's what needs to be on the front page of how we do that.
That's what I appreciated about learning more about Rabbi Heschel, is that here he learned from these rebbes, like, all these, the Torah, but the first time he meets Dr. King, he basically takes all this knowledge in Torah and says, it was easier for the Israelites to cross the Red Sea than it was for Black Americans to cross a college campus. So the idea that he was taking all this knowledge in the Torah and he was bringing it right down to inspire all the rabbis to kind of get out of their books and to take that prayer and to make sure that they are using that Torah knowledge in real life. And that was amazing. And I think that's why, Reverend Warnock, when he recently, won and became the first Black senator from Georgia, I think, it was just, I can't even tell you as a Jewish woman hearing him say, I don't know if these are his exact words, but the sunlight from Heschel and King, but I think symbolically, he understood deeply the gift that the two of them sort of gave to the world, and how we need to really study both of them and what they did together, and continue that legacy moving forward.
I wanted to, Shari, let's go back to you. So I was thinking about this when I was watching the documentary, because the documentary has this really wonderful, beautiful ending. But when I was watching and my son was sitting with me, he was like, well, that looks like a long time ago. Like the ending of the documentary looks like a long time ago to him, because since the ending of the documentary, there have been so many significant events, especially just all the events that happened on January 6th alone, right? So we saw the Georgia Senate win for Reverend Dr. Raphael Warnock, the current pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, which is Dr. King's home church. We saw John Ossoff, a millennial Jew who interned for the late Congressman John Lewis. He also won the other seat. And on that day, we saw this white supremacist siege on the US Capitol. So it's one day, it was so much. Now, if you could do the documentary over, and I mean, if you want to make an addendum, we would love to see it, but whatever. But if you could do the documentary over and extend the ending, what would you change? What would you change? What would you add?
Great question. Well, first of all, the best news is that because the documentary was made by Spill the Honey, which is a nonprofit, I can take all those 80 hours that I didn't use and create like sound bites and small segments for people to use in like 5 to 6 minute pieces with the curriculum. So thank God for that, because I had interviewed a lot of young people actually. So that's one good thing, but it hasn't been sold yet. So I am sort of right now it's being used at temples and Jewish film festivals and churches and community organizations, but I am, before it sells and maybe gets on Netflix or something. I am toying with the idea of, you know, updating the film at the end and making it contemporizing the end. And then maybe adding a few parts in the history part, because I had, you know, Mark Dellinger is this brilliant historian who I think I had interviewed many of the historians in the film that highlight his point about not only was it a negative experience for the Jewish people when there was Black power, Jews got kicked out of the Black movement, but there was also so much positive. Jews, you know, felt safer to put their kippas on. They got involved with protesting Soviet Jewry. They felt, you know, that it was better to, it was okay to like focus on Israel. It wasn't just a negative. So there are some things, how many, you know, Jews became more white and lost that disconnect to, you know, the proximate living when Jews moved out. So there's, you know, there's definitely nuances that I probably would add. But at the same time, you know, I just have to be careful because this film, I feel, is a timeless film. And what I think makes it important is that I didn't write a script. I'm a first-time filmmaker, and it's basically, I basically interviewed recollections of what they witnessed and put it together. So, so it's a fine line. Yeah.
Well, we're interested to see more. We're interested to see more. The next question, I wanted to take it to, I want to hear from Professor Heschel and also TIffany about this next piece. I wanted to ask a question about demythologizing and deconstructing stereotypes. So before we were talking a little bit about bridging, you know, that bridging work. But I wanted to also just recognize that there have been some, over time, our narratives have pulled apart, and there have also been some stereotypes that have come in between us. I'm thinking specifically about how last year George Floyd was killed in front of all of us. We saw it, right, repeatedly almost. And many people took to the streets to protest the killing of George Floyd. And there were lots of Black Lives Matter protests as well that were in the streets. My concern, some of the concerning things I heard were that there were some, not all, this is not an all, but there were some American Jews who were feeling reluctant to be out in those streets because they were connecting Black Lives Matter protests, those Black Lives Matter protests, to the Movement for Black Lives platform that was released in 2016. And really struck a very difficult blow to the relationships between American Jews and Black Americans. And there are also many Black Americans who I've heard are reluctant to stand in solidarity with American Jews against acts of anti-Semitism, whether they're big or they're small, because they don't see them as partners in the work of anti-racism currently. So we need some help demythologizing these stereotypes. I'm going to go to you, Professor Heschel, first. Can you help us with that?
It's a big problem. I agree. Yeah. We have a lot of work to do in the Jewish community, and we're aware of it. I just held a seminar at Dartmouth about this yesterday, basically about racism in the ultra-Orthodox community, but it's not confined. So that's very clear. Mm-hmm. I worry at times that Jews use Israel as an excuse to avoid dealing with their racism. I worry at times that we think about Louis Farrakhan, who is an awful person, in my opinion, but we talk about him as though he is every single Black human being in the United States, and he's not. He's one unfortunate man. So we have, first of all, to overcome the avoidance and the resistance. There is, of course, there are political issues involved here, and people have different positions regarding the state of Israel. But I'll say this: the state of Israel has problems with its government and with its society, of course, just like every other country in the world. And we hope to help that country resolve its problems, just like I'd like to help every country. There are very few countries right now that I can point to with admiration. But that's not a reason for us in any way not to sit down and talk to one another in the Jewish world, to face up to the roots of our racism, and to get out in the streets and in the voting booth and do something to save this country from utter collapse, which is sadly where I feel we're standing right now.
Thank you for that. Tiffany, what would you like to say?
So I've chosen to share this. A couple of things from the documentary that I saw, that though there were shared experiences, there were still deeply some disconnects, right? And with every movement, participants won't be 100% bought in on all sides, right? So whether it's the Black and Jewish movement, all Blacks may not subscribe to that movement. All Jewish people may not subscribe to that movement. But one thing for certain, and two things for sure: every single movement that we have witnessed with our lived eyes and are reading about have a VIP reservation to one particular room, and that's the room for improvement. So we can sit and find ourselves critiquing what the challenges are, what the issues are with movements. But for me, in this particular house that I'm renting, I don't back down from issues of injustice just because one particular thing may not be right. You just will find that Tiffany will not put her mouth on that particular issue. And so I share that as an example because oftentimes with any movement, and this is, as my grandmother would say, a trick of the enemy, we get caught up in the head issues and it disconnects us from the real heart issue that we're talking about. And it goes back to the conversation that we're talking about an ism that has caused harm to humanity.
Mm-hmm.
So the question to every 240 participants on the call is, will you make room? Will you take your own personal ideologies and agenda and scoot over some to make some room for the agendas and the movements of your brothers and sisters that are experiencing the harm and the scars? So that's what I'll share in response to that particular question.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. I love that VIP invitation.
I love that.
Remember that.
Yeah, I just want to add that I think one of the ways to demystify stereotypes is by valuing history and learning about history. And I think that what I also came to learn was a lot of folks don't even know this history. So sometimes finding that we had this alliance in history, it was like finding a lost sister or brother that we didn't know that we had as an ally. And I think we can't underestimate the power of when people have come together to transform the conscience of America, and there was enough of a coalition that the story is an American history story. And I think that we didn't have a lot in common back then either. I mean, we came as immigrants. Blacks came, they were brought here as slaves. We had completely different backgrounds. We didn't agree on Israel probably back then either. I remember reading as I was researching when it was Rabbi Heschel's 60th birthday, and the conservative rabbis knew of their soulmate relationship, that they wanted to honor Rabbi Heschel by honoring Dr. King. And you saw a little bit of that in the film. But if you really go back and study what questions that were asked, that Rabbi Gendler actually asked, those were very serious questions that at that time too, they were saying, well, what's going on with the Black anti-Semitism? What are we Jews doing? And he was very honest, Dr. King. He was saying, sometimes we live close and you're overcharging us, in the stores, and it bothers me, it bothers our community. But yet at the same time, he was so hopeful. He says, but you are our allies. So I guess he was willing to kind of expose the problems, right? And expose that we had differences even on Israel, right? Even at that time. But yet there was enough of this common alliance and the safety in showing up for each other's pain and willing to work together. And like the American Jewish Committee, like the NAACP, who, since this started in 1909, think about this, the founding of this history is in 1909. I focus on the 60s, right? But, I just put a little, that's why each section needs a whole history. each section, you know, we're just unraveling the onion, so to speak, of the history. And I think the more we learn, I think it will help us heal.
I thank you for that. I agree that we need to take some time to learn about each other's history. I also, I know I'm the moderator, but I'm just going to act like a panelist for a second. I also want to just help all of us remember that it is our responsibility to undo our own implicit biases and the stereotypes that are embedded in our own neural paths, right? That come back up whenever we're trying to collect information to figure out how we're going to respond to a cultural difference. So that's our responsibility. That's something that we have to be able to do as well, and recognize when it's a stereotype, and if we're applying a stereotype broadly to all the people who look like or, you know, worship like one person or another, that's when we might cause harm, because we're making assumptions about other people when we don't really know. But it's our responsibility to be able to say, you know what, I want to know more, and I'm not going to make an assumption that I know what's going on with you, or I know how you believe or where you stand on certain issues. And because at the end of the day, I agree with TIffany. At the end of the day, I want to be where your heart is. I want to be able to be aligned with you in this movement for our mutual liberation. So, okay, back to moderator Doris. Okay, so one of the aspects, and I'm doing this a little bit in a little bit of a rushed manner because I see that we're very close on time. One of the aspects I love about this documentary is that I enjoyed seeing that there were several leaders who helped build the Black Jewish coalition, right? I mean, definitely started with between Rabbi Heschel and Dr. King, but it grew like a beautiful seed and blossomed from the love that they had for each other, from the mutuality that they had for each other. And it grew to be like branches of a tree, so that it was spread out to like business leaders and congregational members and city leaders, and everyone took a part. So the question I have for you, and I'll go to Professor Heschel first, who are those coalition leaders today? Where are they?
Coalition. First of all, you know, Bernice Reagan said, if you're in alliance with all the people who agree with you, that's not an alliance. So coalition, actually, we should be in coalition and in alliance with people who disagree with us, first of all. I also think that, you know, we have a lot of work to do in each of us in our own communities. And before we start dragging in somebody else to come and educate us on racism, let's try to do our own work. And there's plenty that we can do. And we can start with some really excellent books that have been published over many decades. And they're great lectures and great films and so on. But I think discussion, consciousness raising, remember the importance of that in the early women's movement, consciousness raising, talking to other people, working things out, one person with another, building relationships, figuring out where is my thinking going wrong. So I actually think there are quite a few coalitions, organizations, good work being done. Places like Repair the World is an amazing organization. I just was with them in Baltimore, the Baltimore group, and it's just fantastic. So alive, and young people and old people and people in between, amazing. Let me also say, since, look, I'm a professor, I'm not a politician or an activist or an organizer, unfortunately, but let me give you something to just think about. And that is, in 1968, my father invited Dr. and Mrs. King and their children to come to our home for the Passover Seder. And Dr. King was assassinated shortly before this Passover began. But we might ask ourselves, all of us, what would it mean? What would you do if Dr. King came to your Seder, if you celebrated a Seder with Dr. King? What would you talk about? What questions would you raise? What commentaries and discussions about the biblical story of the Exodus and its relationship to today? You can read Eddie Glaud's marvelous book, Exodus, to prepare that, or even Michael Walzer's book on Exodus. The story is powerful, and I think it's a nice way to enter, to bring religious observance and the Bible to enter civil rights history, and also try to do something with our own imaginations, with our minds, because actually You know, my father said racism is an eye disease, and it's also a distorted way of thinking. So we need to do some work with our own minds. So that's my suggestion.
I love that suggestion. TIffany, who are the coalition leaders for today, TIffany?
Good question. So a couple of things. This question comes up a lot in these conversations. You know, where the Martins, where the Malcolms, where the fill in the blank, right? And I think that's a question we all need to individually answer, right? And before we answer that question, we also have to understand that that coalition building comes at a cost, and some folks don't want to be taxed. So what we're experiencing now in a lot of communities is a little bit of tax evasion, right? Because to do this work, it comes at a cost. And that means you have to be so rooted in what your personal calling is that you're willing to lay it on the line. Or as it was quoted in the documentary, you're willing to offer your body as protection and security. And that's what we're missing. We can sit and discuss about the great legacies of the folks that were in the documentary, but all of us have a platform and a presence where we could literally pay the cost to do the work, and yet we haven't. And so where are they? Here's a question that I'll ask to answer the question is, when I think about protecting my home, I don't talk to the security company. I go and talk to the robbers who have successfully burglarized several homes because they know how to get into the system. When I want to know how to smoke meat or barbecue meat, as we do in the Midwest, I'm not going to talk to a vegetarian. I'm going to the butcher, right? And so when we talk about doing this work, this anti-racism work, and dismantling that system, we need to ask ourselves, who do we have at the table? Am I talking with the choir, or am I boldly and audaciously making room to speak with the folks that were down at the Capitol on the 6th? I don't know. I just, want to ask ourselves, who do we have at our table, and where are we having the conversations? Are we boldly sitting in the face of that which we desire to challenge, change, or dismantle, or are we simply keeping the conversations where it's comfortable? And I think when we're able to answer that question, we'll be able to identify the coalition builders.
Wow. Shari, what do you think?
Well, I think there's grassroots organizations in every single state that are working together. I mean, American Jewish Committee for sure. I mean, they did a whole huge, amazing event with the urban community. It was Black Jewish Unity. The ADL is constantly working. We're hoping to have a thing with the Shared Legacy Day with the NAACP. The best thing that I feel hopeful about is that there's going to be legislation in this area. I'm from Michigan, and Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence, before blessed memory Congressman John Lewis passed away, she said, our two communities, we have this history together. How come there's never been a Black Jewish caucus? So he says, I'm in. So they created a Black Jewish caucus that's bipartisan. And now there's going to be, I think soon, a bicameral caucus that's going to focus on hate speech and legislation. So you can imagine, Reverend Warnock, and he's not going to just walk in to Congress. He's going to march in praying with his feet, right? That he's still at the Ebenezer Church, right? But he's going to also put on his legislation boots on and get some work done. So I'm kind of hopeful that there's going to be this merging of the spiritual with the legislation. And that's sort of going to somewhat echo and mirror the history of how we got things done. And so, yes, there's so much horrible stuff going on. Horrible. Two people in our movie, an Orthodox rabbi from your own state, Columbia University, Rabbi Berman, who gives so much authenticity to this film, who was in Selma. He just lost his 45-year-old son to COVID. Okay. Reverend Durley, who's an amazing person, who's a huge bridge builder from Atlanta. He just buried, who actually did Reverend C.T. Vivian's funeral. He just buried his wife 2 days ago. So, we're all living in this pain, and it's awful. But, like Rabbi Heschel, when you read his books, you can't live in despair. There's hope. So there's all this negative stuff, but there's all this positive stuff that's going on too, that is bipartisan, that at least in this particular space, you know, we need the strength to love that, like Dr. Martin Luther King, Zenona Clayton learned from, that inspired her to meet with the Ku Klux Klan every single day, the head dragon, until by the end of the year, he was hugging her. So we need to learn these lessons of the strength to love, like Dr. Heschel said, Susannah Heschel, that there's a strategy to this. It's not just like, you know, showing up nonviolence is also showing up and being able to tolerate somebody completely who you oppose to, but yet you know that you kind of know that if there's a soul in there, that eventually good will come out of it if you stay in it. If you stay in it, you know, if you stay in it, God willing, that good will rise and you know.
That good will rise. Amen.
Good will rise.
I think it's also, can I just
Please.
say one thing? It's important for Jews to recognize that 10 to 15% at least are Jews of color. And so when we talk about Jewish interests, what does that mean? When we have Jewish organizations that hesitate to speak out against racism, they're hesitating to speak out on behalf of their fellow Jews. That's very troubling. So we really do need a major change in our way of thinking and also in our organizations. And I would just add to that I was very disturbed after the January 6th insurrection to read some of the reactions of certain Jewish organizations that were really, really not appropriate. When I saw how the whole country came together, most of the country, to condemn what had happened, the vast majority of Americans were outraged. And to find these very hesitant kind of little statements from some of these Jewish federations, including the one here in Boston where I live, that was very upsetting to me. So I think we also have to realize that these we have work to do in our big Jewish organizations, and we need to actually take charge of them, because our so-called leadership is not representing the views of the vast majority of Jews. And that has to change. We do need a new set of leadership in the Jewish world, and a much broader representation.
Like leaders like in the film, Yavila McCoy, like you said, Dr. Heschel, so many Black Jews of color are really, Black Jews are, you know, at the forefront of this conversation, so they can help bridge the gap. And, you know, we need to learn more from them and let their leadership be more out front.
Yeah, and I would say also, I'm pretending to be a panelist now. I would say also that it is also listening to, paying attention to the lived experiences of those who are vulnerable and oppressed in this country, right? So if we're talking about coalition building between American Jews and also Black Americans, what does it mean to live as a Black American in this country in this time, right? What are those lived experiences like? How can we be empathetic to them? And how can we also ensure that when we have positions that we can leverage or open doors for our fellow Black Americans, that we also give them the opportunity to step into those places and shine, right? And become very excellent, which we've seen like Reverend Dr. Raphael Warnock. He is amazing, the things that he's been able to achieve. And there are many like him. We need to find ways to leverage those opportunities to create that coalition, because the coalition is not just let's be friends in the synagogues and in the churches, but also let's be friends in the streets. Let's be friends in our business communities. Let's be friends in our homes, in our communities, wherever we are, in our schools.
Yeah, but if Black lives really matter to us, life starts with health. And if we don't have access to health care, and if we have these outrageous disparities in health outcomes, that has to change. That's where it starts. Ditto for social welfare programs in this country. I don't understand why every other industrialized country has social welfare programs, health access, and educational equality, that all schools are funded in the same way. All of this is incredibly backward and destructive, and at its core racist. social welfare programs were denied by legislatures around the country because they didn't want government aid going to Black people. And they were willing to even sacrifice white people so as not to. The hatred is so deep. That's the problem. And I understand that. And I've written a book about the Nazi period, and I spent a lot of time reading German anti-Semitic literature, and I see how deep it is and also how visceral. It's not just about ideas, it's about how people feel. It's about people talking about Jews as disgusting, for example, and repugnant. Yeah, that's disturbing. And there were Jews who had converted to Christianity, and then in October of 1941, they had to wear a yellow star. They had been going to church every week, but when they suddenly came to church with a yellow badge, people didn't want them kneeling next to them at the Eucharist rail, the communion rail. They didn't want them singing in a church choir. They'd been there for years singing in the choir, but all of a sudden they became a Jew and they became repugnant. And these were not rules coming down from the Nazi regime. These were simply, so we have to be attentive to the kind of visceral feelings that have been placed into our minds and imagination by racist structures. And at the same time, understand the term Afro-pessimism. What does it mean to be a Black person and know that the state is willing to murder you on the street? For what? For nothing. Without an indictment, without a conviction, nothing. Just murder. Because why? Because you're Black. Because if you're Black, you don't have life worthy of living. So what kind of a country is this? Is this what we want as a country? What kind of a society? What kind of ugliness is this? And I have to say, the soil of this country is screaming with the suffering of Black slaves and Native Americans murdered when we first arrived here. And I say we Americans, we white Americans. Yeah, I didn't come in my family until, it doesn't matter, until 1940, so what? I'm still responsible. My father said some are guilty, but all are responsible.
Powerful. We're way past.
But at the same time, I just want to add the hopefulness too, that, you know, we came as immigrants from the Holocaust, and, you know, there was Jewish papers who were writing about when Blacks were being hung. I mean, that lynched. We just witnessed a public lynching, but historically we worked on anti-lynching before with the NAACP, Brown versus Education. I mean, we have worked together before and we weren't exactly alike. And I just hope that we can also be hopeful about uncovering each other's pain. I take another lesson from Dr. King. When he was in solitary confinement, writing the letter from the Birmingham jail that you saw Clarence Jones speaking about, who helped take that letter out. I mean, we should just read that letter over and over again, but he was so upset his children couldn't go to an amusement park. And how does he explain that? But at the same time, in solitary confinement, he's thinking about, I would have broken the legal laws in Nazi Germany to stand with my Jewish brothers. Like, are you kidding me? He's sitting in solitary confinement and he's also has room in his brain to put to pen thinking about Jews in Nazi Germany. That type of shared empathy, even though this isn't, we had different, you know, I think is so necessary, because Jews throughout, like on college campuses today, are scared. The anti-Semitism is huge. Okay, so like we need the Black community as well to you know, hear our, I mean, it's not about comparisons, but there is still a lot going on that we need to like listen to each other and share each other's stories and our own fears so that we can work on things to get things done.
So if I could just jump in and say two things. I know we're at time, so buckle your seatbelts. I'm gonna talk a little bit quick here, huh?
Okay.
So here's what we have to remember is, all right, we know the ship 1619, we know the history, but here on this ground, in Professor Heschel, as you said, it's riddled with the cries and the blood and the soil of enslaved Africans and indigenous people. But what we recognize is that it really didn't get equal until about 1964. Until the laws were changed on the books. And then we had the unlearning of that. But what makes this struggle a bit unique is that persons during that time were literally asked to start over on the exact same land that they were oppressed the day before. And we're talking just 57 years in the rear view. My father in February, God willing and the creek don't rise, will be 69. So when you think about the transmission of trauma from just his generation to mine, or from my sharecropping great grandparents in Arkansas, those stories are still very real. The fear and those scars are still very real. So when we talk about dismantling and disrupting systems, we're talking about something that for some was just yesterday. And we just have to be mindful and aware of that. And at the same time, understand that there's room. There's room for the stories. There's room for the scars. And Dr. Rogers, I'm sure you will appreciate that there's room to take care of yourselves in the process and in the journey. Because like I said earlier, this work comes at a cost, but you can't pour from an empty cup. So to all of my brothers and sisters, as we come to a close, I say, please take care of yourselves as we do this work. Create that non-negotiable you time where you can kind of recalibrate and come back to center, because the journey continues and they need us to be a part of that.
Amen. Amen.
Amen.
We are definitely at time, but I just wanted to say one more quick thing too. For everyone who is, I mean, I know that the chat has been huge. I have not been looking at it, but I know there's like 60 plus logged comments there. I wanted just to say to all the people who are gathered, I want to encourage you to be accountable for your work, right? So if you want a space where you can meet people, I mean, I know it's pandemic, so we're not able to really be in presence and proximity with each other, but you can still, you know, we're here together. There's like 200 of us here together, right? So if you want a space where you can people and you want to get to know other people, then I would suggest that you create that space. Don't wait for AJC to do it. Don't wait for the WJC to do it. Don't wait for Betor to do it. Don't wait for your synagogue or your church to do it. You just do it, right? And if you want to be in a study group where you can dig deeper into that learning, and you want somebody else to, you want somebody to suggest to you the book, I suggest you go out and find the book. You know, you create the study group, you call people together to do that learning with you. And if you want to attend an event where you can share your culture with other people, I suggest you go and you start and organizing that event. Like, don't wait, right? Be accountable for your own work. Because if we are really going to do this work well, we cannot wait. We cannot wait. We must begin. We should have been, you know, this work actually has already been begun for us. We're just picking up the pieces and we're moving along, but we cannot wait. We cannot wait any longer because it's been too long. And don't wait for anyone else to get the message too. You're the ones who are here, all 200 of you, you have the message, you carry the light. And as the Bible has told us, when you carry the light, the dark cannot overcome it. The darkness cannot overcome your light. So I want to just encourage all of you, you are the light, you hold the light inside of you. Please go and shine your light to everyone. Thank you so much for being with all of us. Who is in charge now? Because we are definitely over time. Lisa, I think Lisa's in charge now. Lisa Ginsburg, are you in charge?
Great. Well, I'm going to go ahead and ask some questions. There were some great questions that came up. The first one, which links directly to the film and also looks forward to today, said, why do you think the Black-Jewish alliance fell apart in the 70s, and how can we strengthen it now? So what can we learn from that, and what can we do differently now?
Dr. Heschel, you want to answer that one first? You're muted. You're muted.
Not entirely clear that we fell apart. Some coalition fell apart. After the death of Dr. King, after the death of my father. All right, there was a time when, for example, Black nationalism said, we want to make this our own movement. And I understand that. And it was the same period of time when Jews were celebrating the 1967 victory of the state of Israel. And they were becoming increasingly concerned with Jewish nationalism and Zionism. And so we moved really in parallel directions. I think there were conflicts over affirmative action, for example, which disturbed me because I think of affirmative action as something very good for me as a woman, and half the Jews are women. So for Jewish organizations to oppose affirmative action is for them to oppose the assistance that can be given to half the Jews. At any rate, I think that coalitions continue to exist, perhaps in a different way. It was a different moment in history. We were dealing by the 1980s with Ronald Reagan, who was a very different kind of president. But you know, the leaders were still there. The hearts were still there. We moved in nationalist directions on our own paths for a while, but we really do want to come together. And that wish to come together has been very strong all these years.
You know, the one piece I want to share with that is it's definitely difficult to be actively part of a movement when you also are actively being taken out, right? Dr. King was assassinated by the very country he was working to get the justice and equality for, right? And so that sent a message, and a message of deeply rooted fear. And you can fast forward to several movements of present where similar protesters and agitators, if you will, find themselves not with us anymore. And so when I speak about doing this work comes at a cost, I'm literally sharing that. Is there a willingness ultimately to give up your life for this movement? Because history has shown, in recent time has shown, that that is a possible outcome. And so maybe that has prevented folks or from coming to the table, or just taking a different route. Because I will share, support doesn't always seek the center stage, if you will. So there may be coalitions, we may just not know about it, for the protection of the unfortunate and weak, if you will. So there's that piece too.
And TIffany, I have to add, it's even within our own communities. When Dr. King, at the end of his life, he wasn't so well liked by the Black community either. And Rabbi Heschel had, even though he had so many rabbis that admired him, and he has gone on to live this unbelievable legacy, a lot of Jewish people were like, why are you always worried about the Black community? Like, aren't you, you should be focusing more on Israel. Why are you focusing on, getting Dr. King to like focus on Vietnam right now when the transgenerational wounds to the Jewish people and the state of Israel and our own fear of annihilation lives with us. So, I'm just trying to say, even within our own communities, there's, it's hard to support each other sometimes. I don't know if I answered that, but I'm just saying that we have to also remember that as well, that it's not just two separate coalitions coming even within, that we have to think about and look at history, that it was hard, that it's hard. But I'm going to be positive again, like even the work I'm doing, right? I mean, we're ultimately souls. We're only here on this earth for such a short period of time in the big picture, and who knows when it's our last day, God forbid, right? But when you do work together and you work on something bigger than yourself and you work together with other people, I can't tell you the feeling. It's like there's no greater high. I mean, it's really, and it shows because the civil rights leaders who are like, Clarence Jones is 90 years old. He's working his butt off. Him and Andrew Young, I mean, they're still pounding the pavement, but they, you know what? To them, I don't think it's work. They're like elated. So Sherry Frank, what she did with Congressman Lou, I mean, everybody who has worked together, there is this sort of high that you get from caring about humanity and realizing that you're part of this bigger picture here, and that, that just doing your little part can make a big difference.
I completely agree with that. It's we don't have to be senators and congressmen. We don't have to be the daughter of an amazing rabbi who has changed history. We don't have to be a filmmaker. We can be who we are, and we can use what we have to work on that coalition, to work on addressing what happened in the history and what we can do forward. We can also build relationships that transform while we are yet being transformed ourselves. It starts with us. It starts with also offering a handout and an invitation and saying, I invite you to join me in this work. I want to know you better. Let's be in relationship with one another. And that's where it begins. You don't need all the titles. You don't need all the wonderful things that do come with history's gaze on us. We can do it wherever we are. It begins with us.
So it's a perfect segue to an important question, which is, how do we share these important messages in education with young people? How do we pass it on?
Well, the film is a great start. Talking to young people, we can have the film shown in our public libraries, community centers, churches, synagogues, mosques. We can have conversations at home with our neighbors, have a film watching party. That would be a great thing, great way to start.
I was just going to hop right on to that and share that's something that we're looking forward to doing at PACE, hosting the film, hosting a dialogue, making room for the conversations is extremely critical. And we can take advantage of being in this virtual space because these conversations aren't easy to have. But guess what? If you're in the comfort of your home, you know, you have a space at least that's familiar that can allow you to be present. And when you see those opportunities, I can't stress enough, do not underestimate the value of being present. Our young people love sitting at the feet of the elders, as we say in my home, sitting at the feet, gleaning from our elders, hearing the stories. We desire that. And I think being shifted to this space of isolation has reprioritized that for all of us, the power of presence in proximity.
Yeah, and I would say, like, as I was saying, I took 80 hours. So like I interviewed the son of the man who actually wrote Strange Fruit, who was a Jewish man The Strange Fruit was one of the most important songs that Billie Holiday sang about the white people who were standing around smiling as three black men were lynched. And when he saw that picture, he was so disgusted with that picture that he wrote a poem because his family was escaping pogroms. And he went to, and he handed the poem to Billie Holiday that became one of the most famous songs, Strange Fruit. And so taking all these making 5-minute videos and putting a curriculum or some work with it and having students who sometimes, or all of us, sometimes we don't have the attention span to watch this film, which is, 95 minutes, but we can watch 5-minute segments and just take each piece and let's talk about each piece, because this, we can't underestimate the power of film. It even reflects Dr. King's brilliance when there was 500, 12 and 13-year-olds that were out pounding the pavement in the 60s in Birmingham. He knew that if they got caught on television, that it would wake up the country. The horrible lynching of George Floyd woke up the country because we all can't breathe in our own homes. I mean, film is, seeing something, not everybody can read something and get feelings, So sometimes film, can light a fire in your soul that just reading a book can't. Everybody learns differently and everybody is affected, but we could see the power of seeing the lynching of George Floyd, how the entire world has woken up and said, like, enough is enough. And while there's so much horrible stuff that's going on, there still is positive. There's more white people all over the world who's saying, like, we have to attend to this racism and everywhere. So I still am hopeful.
Can I just say another thing that's a great thing to do is to take a trip to go to visit civil rights sites, civil rights museums in Birmingham, Montgomery, and Selma. Go to Mississippi, go to Atlanta, look at the history, go to Charleston. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, after COVID, that's a must. I mean, there's nothing like, we have a museum in our own country, and that's Selma. So like, why did I bookend the film with Selma? Because Selma's where we all came together where it eventuated in the Voting Rights Act. And if you go there, we need to invest money in Selma. There should be a voting rights center there. I mean, it's our own country. And there's the Jackson Home, that's a museum where people came together, as you saw in the film, before they marched. I mean, we need to honor our own land here and invest in it.
Okay, this is Liz. I'm gonna jump in. This was an incredible discussion. It could go on and on. I first saw Shared Legacies this summer when we selected it as an AJC-sponsored program at the Stanford JCC Film Festival. I watched it for the third time today. And afterwards, I got so many requests from Bet Torah congregants to do another program. This was my dream panel tonight, moderated by the amazing Reverend Dalton. Thank you, Reverend Dalton, and Shari for making this important and powerful film, and Susannah and TIffany for sharing your knowledge and personal experience as well as your heart and soul. And thank all of you. Over 200 people on this Zoom. Clearly, we all agree this is a conversation that must continue. As TIffany said, we need to make room for you and your story. Westchester Jewish Council made this countywide discussion happen, and American Jewish Committee immediately agreed to co-sponsor this important event. We will be in touch about future programs and ways to combat racism. We've got work to do. So do something after this program. Try to think differently. Read a book like Cast. Watch Just Mercy or I Am Not Your Negro, or if you haven't seen Shared Legacies, watch Shared Legacies. Ask questions. Be bold and audacious. How significant that we all gather to talk and listen in honor of Martin Luther King Jr. Day. It takes all our voices to make the necessary changes. In closing, remember his words. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You.